Hello everyone, welcome back to Soundrise. I'm your host Alex and I'm here with my friend Vlada. Vlada, how is your life going?
Going pretty great. How are you doing?
I'm doing great as well. I've been lately discovering a lot of new music. This current situation, well, the good side of it is that you have a bit more time for hobbies, at least in my case, and I've discovered some really good stuff. Also some not so good stuff. Let's face it, but yeah.
What do you mean? What stuff is not so good? What is it that you found? What is it that you wasted time on?
Certain Grammy-winning records, to be honest.
Oh, you were exploring the Grammy winners of the recent years?
Yeah, of the last 20 odd years, and some of them, in my personal view, just didn't deserve it, to be honest.
Well, I applaud your courage. I wouldn't engage in such a futile effort.
Yeah, you just start questioning, is it really worth kind of rating that type of award? Is it really down to awards? I think it's not. I think you're the one that should either award it or criticize it, to be honest.
Oh, well, with these things, I mean, at the end of the day, it also comes down to somebody's taste, and I find a lot of these awards to be more about whatever the current trend is in the music industry and whatever is getting the most media exposure. So at the end of the day, I think the best way to seek new music is to pay attention to uh, what other people say rather than just the official awards.
Yeah, and you just mentioned the media. Me personally, I am pretty much into music, but I don't read the papers at all. And one of the reasons why I don't do it is because um, many musicians have kind of disliked what the media says. For example, The Cure and Robert Smith. A lot of media tell us that they were goth rock or something like that, and then you have Robert Smith saying, "I never said that. That's nonsense."
Well, that's when we come down to the question of labels, and genres. So I think when it comes to truly great artists, it's very difficult to put any labels on them. So there's no wonder a lot of these people would disagree with how the music media has labeled them.
That's right. And speaking of genres, today's episode is a bit different. We're actually not going to talk about one band and or one record. This episode is going to actually be kind of genre centric because we're going to be talking about a specific genre, and also three bands and three records. The
And
genre is, yeah,
a specific label as well.
and a specific label. That's right.
Yes.
So we're actually going to talk about jazz. And the three records that we're going to be talking about today. The first one is Aftenland by the Norwegian musician Jan Garbarek. The second one is The Amazing Adventures of Simon Simon, released by John Sherman and Jack DeJohnette. And the final record is The Sea, another Norwegian musician, which is Kjetil Bjarnstad. So I just want to quickly, before we start discussing these records, I just want to quickly talk about the genre jazz. Now, obviously, Vlada, as far as I know, you started listening to this type of music when you were 15, right?
Yes. Yes, I started listening to jazz rather early, and I think what really brought me to jazz was rock from 1960s. A lot of great rock musicians from that era were naturally influenced by jazz musicians, as jazz was in many ways the most progressive music that you had at the time, especially late 50s, early 60s. So, especially after listening to these jam-oriented bands like Grateful Dead and the Allman Brothers Band, I had an itch to get into jazz, and of course, it started with John Coltrane, who is by many considered the greatest jazz musician of all time. But having said that, I have to say that I've always been on and off with jazz. I'm more into rock music, and sometimes I need to hear that melody, I need to hear those lyrics. Um, but I kept coming back to jazz, and now in recent years I've been listening to jazz rather heavily, especially the label we're going to talk about today, the ECM label, known for some of the greatest jazz records ever made. And jazz is, as a genre, it's so rich, so vast. It goes beyond whatever you may think jazz is if you're not truly familiar with it. And I think this is why I decided to feature these records today. I also want to bring more attention to them, as I often feel they're just a niche, and that there's a very small people truly enjoying them.
Yeah, good point. Well, me personally, on the other hand, I've never really been a fan of jazz music. To be honest, I do admire and respect a lot of jazz musicians, such as Jack Pastorius, Michael League, and I know that they are absolute masterminds when it comes to their music knowledge and also how they play their instrument, which is absolutely wicked. And I consider them not just being jazz legends, but also music legends in general. So I do admire the music. I can't really say that it's bad, but it's not, at this point, it's not really my taste. It's not really something that I go to that often.
Mm-hmm.
So listening to these records was kind of a mixed reviews, to be honest. So let's start with the let's say the oldest one here, which is Aftonland by Jan Garbarek. This record was released in 1980, and to be honest, I wasn't a big fan of it. I'm still not a big fan of it, to be honest. It sounded a bit boring. It's not really the type of music that moves me. I know it's kind of an atmospheric vibe incorporated in this album, but yeah, just not hugely impressed with it. What about you?
Well, I knew this record would be a difficult listen because it's definitely not an album I would start listening to if I was uninitiated with jazz, or with the ECM label that we're talking about today. It's a very atmospheric record. It doesn't have anything that propels the music. There's only two instruments, the organ and the saxophone. So it's not something that's easy to take in. However, I feel that this is a record of great beauty. When I listen to this, it takes me back to the time when I lived in Norway, specifically in the north of Norway, especially the dark period during the winter. I imagine these snow-covered mountains under the polar lights in the sky, and I feel like, especially Jan Garbarek's saxophone tone, perfectly captures this Norwegian atmosphere. To me, he's the sound of Scandinavia. He's the sound of Norway. And that's why I wanted to start with this record today. Jan Garbarek, to me, is one of the most unique saxophone players that ever lived. His sound is unlike anything else I've ever heard. And most importantly for me personally, the way it resonates with me is that it takes me back to that time, when I lived there. And I know it may sound odd, but this music really conjures images in my head. Those images that I've seen so many times in the past.
That's an important aspect, to be honest, because if you're able to connect your music with something in your life, in this case, we're talking about Norway because obviously you spent some time living there, and also, well, I wouldn't really connect this type of music with Norway. And by the way, Vlad and I, we both speak Norwegian. Um, when it comes to Norway, the thing that comes to my mind is indie rock, dream pop, and that 2000 stuff, a bit softer and a bit more contemporary compared to this music. So yeah, and also quickly before we play a track from this album, some some professional ratings. They call it professional ratings from All Music and the Rolling Stone Jazz Record Guide. Pretty low ratings. All Music gave it a 2 out of 5, 2 stars, and yeah, the other source, the Rolling Stone Jazz Record Guide, these guys gave them 3 out of 5. Uh, we don't take this 100% as an accurate source, but
I mean, it's subjective, and to me, it's shocking that anyone would give it such a low rating because the musicianship of these people is unquestionable. So I feel like these bad ratings mostly stem from the fact that this record really deviates from how people think of jazz. You may argue that this is not even a true jazz record, but its improvisational nature certainly argues the opposite, right? So I don't know. I call our listeners to take a listen to this one. Maybe don't make it the first listen out of these 3 records we're going to cover today, but eventually go to it with an open mind, relax, maybe lie down or sit and let the music do the talking.
that's some good suggestions from your side. So let's play a snippet of some of these tracks, since you were obviously a much bigger fan of this record than I am. I'll let you pick one track from this album.
Okay, I would pick Iskirken or the Ice Church, right? It kind
Yeah,
of reminds me of the Arctic Cathedral in Tromsø. Actually, the whole record reminds me of that Arctic Cathedral because it was probably the most acoustic space in the north of Norway, and a lot of concerts were held there. And the sound was amazing, and you can tell by listening to this record that this was also recorded in a similar environment. This record was recorded in a church. That's why it features the church organ alongside the saxophone. So this is definitely a very representative song from the record, Iskirken.
okay, Iskirken from Jan Garbarek.
an excerpt from Iskirken by Jan Garbarek, and on the church organ, Kjell Jansen, right? Alexander, was that pronounced well?
I guess it is.
We'll
Maybe,
hear from our Norwegian listeners.
yeah.
Hopefully, I'll survive the onslaught.
Exactly. So before we move on to our next record, let's just quickly give our final ratings for this one. Vlada, on a scale of 1 to 10.
I would say this record is 8. I would say 8. So it's not the best record out there. It's very atmospheric, very experimental. However, I truly appreciate its atmosphere and the sound. And even now, listening to this part of Iskirken, it gave me chills just hearing that Jan Garbarek sound. So 8 out of 10 for me.
Okay, I'm gonna give it a 5. I think that's a
boo.
To be honest, from my side. So a 5 out of 10. And now we're moving on to the record called "The Amazing Adventures of Simon Simon." And apart from having the same label as the previous album, another thing that connects the two is that this was recorded in Norway. But the musicians are not Norwegian, actually. Well, these two, let's say the main musicians here, John Sermon and Jack DeJohnette.
The only ones. They're the only two people on the record.
Yeah.
Like, they play all the instruments, yes.
Yeah, I'm actually looking at the personnel list, and they are also... they are listing the engineer, the photography, and those guys are Norwegian, actually.
Yes, actually, because we're talking about the ECM label, a lot of their records were recorded in Oslo. So it's a German label, by the way, but there's a very deep connection between this label and Norway, and all the greatest names of the Scandinavian jazz in general are on this label.
Yes, I can see that the producer is German, and so this album it came across as refreshing and pretty different, if you ask me, compared to Aftonland, because I thought it sounded much more contemporary and much easier to listen to for a young person, if you ask me, or for someone who's not a jazz fan like I am. And obviously, John Sermon with the saxophone and Jack DeJohnette as the drummer, I thought they were absolutely superb. I just love listening to this album. So a completely different feeling with this album.
Well, yeah, this album is an album I would definitely recommend to anyone wanting to dig deeper into the ECM jazz or jazz in general, even though these three records we're talking about today are not typical jazz records. They're very experimental, this one included. But this one is so beautiful. John Sermon is known for a lot of interesting sounds and overdubs, and let's take the first track here, Nestor's Saga. The way it builds the atmosphere, it's so enchanting, so miraculous even, I would say, and it's very reminiscent of Pink Floyd's Shine on You Crazy Diamond. Not in a bad way, of course, but it matches that type of atmosphere, which I think is very rare. I haven't really heard that anywhere else, which is why I find this song absolutely amazing and a beautiful way to start a record. And then when Jack DeJohnette comes in with the drums, it just takes it to another level, because this guy really pushed the boundaries when it came to drumming. Here he basically paints with his brushes and his drumsticks, and just something to marvel at. So definitely two masterful musicians. Beautiful, beautiful performance.
Yeah, yeah, good point. I think this is a good starting point for a newcomer in the jazz world, and this is an album that I will probably come back to in the near future. I would also like to point out one fun fact about this album. The album cover is among the top 100 best album covers. So
Yes,
that's pretty interesting.
as chosen by the late Storm Thorgerson, the famous designer of album covers who worked very tightly with Pink Floyd and was a very close friend of theirs. So he chose this album sleeve as one of his top 100 favorite album sleeves. So
Yeah.
another link to Pink Floyd. So it's quite interesting. And definitely, if you're a Pink Floyd fan, check out this record.
Yeah, I tend to talk about album covers quite often. I do find them important when it comes to the overall experience with a certain band or a certain record. So I would really like to hear from our listeners whether they find it important, whether they kind of look after some specific album covers. Because I have experienced like a situation where I choose an album to listen to, an album that I'm not familiar with, and the music is not that good, but I actually wanted to take a listen because the album cover was so convincing.
Yeah, I think I also want to hear from our listeners what your favorite album sleeves are, whether these images ever go together with the music on the record in your mind, whether they enhance the experience or not. Because for me, it's definitely an important part of listening to a record. It's a part of what makes it a complete work of art, right? And sometimes I'm afraid that in this digital era, that part of listening to the music, that part of the whole experience, is kind of getting overlooked.
Yes, it is. It is. So let's conclude this album with a bit of a track. Let's pick a track from this album. I'm gonna pick. I'm not gonna pick the obvious choice, Nestor Saga. I'm actually gonna pick the Buccaneers, which is the second track on this album. And before we play it, let's just give our ratings. For me, 8 out of 10.
For me, this is 10 out of 10. Definitely one of the best jazz records I've ever heard. It may not be everyone's cup of tea, but I encourage everyone to check it out. It's beautiful music. It's very atmospheric, experimental, but at the same time quite catchy and melodic in a jazzy kind of way, right? And it's just another marvelous ECM release.
So, dear listeners, this coming from a lifelong jazz fan, you should definitely take a look at this album. So let's play now. Let's play the Buccaneers. Okay, good stuff. Now
Great
we
stuff,
are,
right?
yeah. Now we are approaching our final record for today, and I just wanna say that the first record was released in 1980. The second was released in 1981, and now we're moving on to a record that was released slightly, a little bit later in 1995. Um, this is an album by another Norwegian musician, which is Kjetil Bjørnstad. First of all, the album cover on this one is absolutely Norwegian, if you ask me.
Yeah, definitely. And ECM as a label is very known for its visual identity. So you might have noticed that looking at these album covers. And this one and the previous record we listened to are prime examples of that. Beautiful photography, makes there's something mystical about it, right? It's either beautiful landscape or uh, a photo that invites a listener to try to interpret it alongside the music. So yeah, this one is definitely a very Norwegian album cover.
Yeah,
So
and it actually features some really good Norwegian musicians, such as Terje Rypdal, the guitarist. And for me, this album, it sounded very good, but I have to highlight the guitar here because it was magnificent. And probably because, both of us, we're rock fans. We're big fans of rock music. And the guitar here, to me, it can almost fit in any rock song, to be honest.
well, yeah, it's the legendary Terje Rypdal, a wonderful Norwegian musician, an unsung rock guitar player. Not rock, but yeah, you could say he's a rock player, even though he's primarily a jazz musician. But I hope the jazz purists won't take this against me. But his sound is, I would say, his sound is in many ways very close to something that, for example, um, David Gilmour was doing, or maybe something, generally speaking, that sort of prog rock guitar style. And I like the way Terje Rypdal fuses rock and jazz together, just truly masterful and unique. And if you had to choose the star of this record, he might be the star, even though it's Kjetil Bjørnstad's great compositions that really take this one to the next level, I would say, alongside the amazing musicians.
Yeah, exactly. So, can you kind of define the roles of each instrument here? So, what kind of vibe did you get from the piano and from the guitar? And yeah.
So, first, I want our listeners to get the idea of what this record is like. This is not a typical jazz record, but now I really mean it, because the other two, they had that kind of jazzy vibe to them, but this one has more of a neoclassical vibe for me, I would say, even though there's definitely some improvisation here, especially when it comes to guitar solos, but it's a very melodic, very melancholy record, very emotionally resonant. It's something that um, it conjures memories, conjures situations where, I don't know, it's very wistful, very sad. Um, it's also grandiose in its composition. And when it comes to individual instruments, you have this beautiful sparse piano introducing the themes, and then you have the build up with cello and the guitar and the drums coming in, the drums gently propelling the music so that it doesn't get boring. This is the kind of music that is not very fast paced. On the contrary, it's very slow, and it's all about striking that chord with you, getting into your heart.
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting description. Apart from the music and also the album cover, what I like about this album, which is pretty unusual, is that actually the names of the tracks, because usually you have a different name for every track on your album. This one is completely, it has basically the same name. So the first track is called the C1, the second track is called the C2, and it goes
Yeah.
all the way to 12. So that simplicity is really interesting, and it doesn't really reflect the music from the record.
Um, well, I would maybe slightly disagree with you there, because I think it's a single piece of music. That's why all the tracks have the same name, because that's the idea. This is about the sea, and what conjures, uh, what this record conjures in my mind again are the Norwegian landscapes, but unlike Aftenland, this one recalls windy autumn days, walking by the sea, observing the mountains in the distance. And there is that sadness to it that makes it easy to relate to different situations and people. And, there is just something transcendental about this record. This is a beautiful album. Maybe one of the most beautiful pieces of music I've ever heard.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's pretty interesting. So, okay. The rating for this album, Vlada?
Well, again, I'll give it a 10. There's a reason why I suggested these albums for today. So, definitely, just like the previous record, I wouldn't call this a jazz album at all. I think it's something entirely different, even though it was recorded by jazz musicians. But it's a wonderful piece of music that I'm just so happy to have discovered this record in recent months. So I hope everyone else will take a chance on this one.
Yep. Okay. From my side, again, 8 out of 10. And to be honest, maybe the second and the third records from today are gonna be my baby steps towards kind of starting to accept the jazz music as something that I genuinely like. So now we're approaching the very end of our episode. Dear listeners, we would like to hear your feedback. We'd also like you to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And also, we've got some good news. So we're officially on Facebook. You can just type facebook.com/soundrisepod. And also, we're members of Patreon. So if you want to support our work and help our podcast grow, just start following us over there. So yeah, Vlada, do you have something to say as your final word?
Well, I would like our listeners to tell us more about which jazz records they love. And also, again, I would like to hear more about album covers, since the ECM label has such a strong visual identity. I want you guys to tell us how important album covers are for your enjoyment of music.
Yeah, so thanks again for listening, and we'll see you then in the next episode.